Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas Kevin Dolan, and I am the writer and author of Little Fag, A Journey of Self-Acceptance and Healing. And today I'm going to read chapter 6. It's entitled Internalized Homophobia, Internalized Oppression. It begins on page 165 of my memoir. I thought coming out would be easy after my marriage ended. I thought my friends would understand and reward me for my honesty. My heart broke watching them turn their backs, then walk away. As a straight husband, my homophobia had raged unchecked. I would make jokes and mutter comments designed to hurt and humiliate, all at my gay community's expense. My revulsion was always there, on display, exposed for the world to see. I couldn't explain my behavior. I couldn't explain my lie. In those years, I had only hurt and humiliated myself. What I braved. Simply put, internalized homophobia happened to me when I was subjected to society's negative perceptions, intolerance, and stigmas towards gay people. And as a result, I turned those ideas inward, believing they were true. Internalized homophobia prevented me from leading a fulfilled life. It anchored and helped me stay in a place of perpetual shame, stress, and anxiety. An alarm went off if there was any indication that someone might be gay. I was not going to be presumed gay by the company I kept, as much as a part of me wanted to. I created bitterness, anger, and loneliness in my life. It is what held and prevented me from coming out of the closet and following the opportunity to be seen and loved for who I was. I can remember on so many occasions when I'd make jokes about gay people, all as a means to deflect attention away from me. Oftentimes, when I didn't check myself, I'm sure I harmed many people around me that were gay, and I didn't know. My outbursts were judgmental, harmful, and hateful. For that, I am truly sorry. In a twist of karmic fate, I think I may have healed my internal homophobia. At least that was my intention when this circumstance came my way. My former wife's youngest brother had played national level and professional volleyball. While married, I remember over Sunday dinner at my mother-in-law's home listening to him comment on the news that a teammate on Team Canada's national volleyball team had come out. Being rather sensitive to news about gays while in the closet as a married man, my heart raced when he commented, "He better not look at me while we're showering, or I'll kill him." Not good news for the brother-in-law who would eventually tell his sister her husband was gay. Long ago, I flew to Calgary to watch my nephew's hockey game. As I was driving from the airport to the arena, my sister, my nephew's mom, called and asked me a very interesting question. "Do you know or have you heard of a guy, not sure of his last name, but he's really tall, and I think he used to play with Canada's national volleyball team. His name seems familiar to me." I said in the calmest of tones, yet freaking out inside, "That is my former wife's youngest brother. I was just thinking of him earlier in the week." My sister loves this expression, "Oh my God." It's what she bellowed when I answered her. She went on to share, "His son plays on," as she cleared her throat, "your nephew's team." The words stated long ago, "or I'll kill him," rang in my ears. I imagined attempting to explain to my nephew, although he knew I had been married and that I was gay, but explaining to an 11-year-old that the dad of one of his hockey buddies used to be my brother-in-law felt a little weird, so I didn't go there. After over 2 decades of really knowing nothing about my former wife and her family, I was one short ride away from seeing my former brother-in-law, and in a twisted kind of way I thought, thank God it's not in a public shower. I began to think of all the healing that had taken place in more than 2 decades of my life. since last seeing my former wife. I was poised to reconnect with the brother of one of the greatest loves of my life. I was about to walk into a hockey arena as my nephew's gay uncle, or what I like to be called, Gunkle Thomas. I was about to walk into a place that is known for fights breaking out. I noticed a tinge of panic when I thought of the reception my former brother-in-law might have given his gay teammate as he shared his coming out story. This circumstance was priceless, perfect, and without a doubt, an amazing opportunity to trust the wisdom of life to unfold exactly the way it needed to. It might even have been a balance of the scales of karmic in my life as it pertained to me being the homophobe. As I walked into the arena, I sensed a bit of discomfort in my sister and some of her hockey moms. Intuitively, I looked for an escape route. It's something that we do as gay people, just in case our audience is not as open to us as we'd hoped. I chuckled at how ridiculous it seemed, but noticed how proud I was for thinking about my own safety. Plus, if it all went awry, I thought maybe the hockey mums would have my back. As I walked into the ice arena, there stood my former brother-in-law, all 6'5" of him. The last time I saw him, he was 20-something years old. How did he end up with a 12-year-old son? I quickly snapped out of my nostalgic haze, reached out my hand and said, "It's amazing to see you. Won't this make for a quirky story over Sunday dinner?" He laughed, and I began to breathe. I stood with him. I felt safe. He looked me in the eye. We laughed. I shared that his wife told him years ago, when his sister and I first got married, that she thought I was gay. I noticed a profound sense of gratitude while we chatted. I had moved from a place of wondering about my former wife, her family, and her brother, now standing in front of me, to now knowing some things I had at times longed to know, but somehow thought I'd missed in this lifetime. I reminded him of the comment he made about his volleyball teammate, and I shared that I had imagined that he'd hit me if he ever saw me again. He turned a bit red with embarrassment and said, "I was such an ass." I ended my time with him by asking him to say hello to all those amazing people that had been a part of my life. He enthusiastically said, "Absolutely." As I released his hand from our goodbye handshake and started walking away, I turned back and said, "Thanks for not hitting me." What I braved that day was creating my own sense of safety and trusting that the universe had my back. And my nephew's team beat his son's team. The unlearning. My wife and I made an agreement after I came out that I would go to our friends and explain why we were no longer together. We would do that together. It would take but a few interactions to realize that instead of me coming out to these friends, my wife had already done the coming out for me. She had outed me. There were many doors that I knocked on, some of my friends who had been in my life for decades, that would not be answered. Few were willing to see me. There were many doors that I thought folks whom I'd loved would open and welcome me with open arms. That didn't happen. One couple who did see me reminded me of the ties and the lies I told while I was actually married. And of course, one of them was, "Till death do us part." And of course, those vows were taken in front of a cathedral full of people. And of course, these friends reminded me that their daughter, who was a flower girl, was one to have come to him to say, "But didn't Uncle Tom say that he'd be with his wife until death do they part?" That was the beginning of the shame I'd be forced to endure while I came out to them. It felt devastating. After a year, about a year after coming out, and experiencing the loss of close to 99% of the friends I had while married, I walked into a restaurant where my former best man was, and longtime high school best friend was dining. He was a man I had great love for and respect for. The restaurant had become a favorite place to dine for me, with the first man I had come out to and fallen in love with. As I halted myself at the door, my boyfriend immediately noticed my hesitancy. "Are you okay?" he asked. My head dropped, my heart pounded, and I gently whispered, "That man at the table was my best man at my wedding. Do you want to leave, he asked with great compassion. My thought at the time was very cliche and perhaps a bit naive. It was, time heals all wounds. I said, no, let's stay. We were quickly ushered to our table. Coming out is a process of understanding, accepting, and valuing your sexual orientation and identity. Typically, it involves both exploring your identity and sharing your identity with others. I hadn't explored any part of being gay. That was way too scary for me. Plus, cheating on my wife didn't feel right either. I simply came out to my wife, then ventured out into this world, sharing with friends that I was gay. There was nothing gradual about my coming out. Although I'd known that I was gay all my life, choosing the time to come out was very sudden. It was the most courageous moment of my life. Heterosexism has had a strongly enforced code of behavior regarding sexual orientation and gender identity, and most people receive the message that they must be heterosexual and act according to society's definition of their gender. I bought that hook, line, and sinker. Little did I know that coming out meant facing tremendous societal responses and attitudes towards me as an out gay man. I felt ashamed, isolated, and afraid. It took only a moment for my former best man to notice I was in the restaurant. After turning and looking at me, he rose from his seat. Although I was nervous about him coming over to the table, a part of me actually felt excited. I still loved him. I really thought he was coming over to say hello. After rising from his seat, he put on his coat and quickly left the restaurant. I felt devastated. I felt ashamed. I felt hated. Although coming out can be difficult, it can also be very liberating and very freeing. I could finally be authentic and true to who I was. Although the community I gathered around me as a married man had disappeared overnight, I found a whole community of people like me who supported me, inspired me, and came to love me. The reward far exceeded the challenge that coming out entailed. The unlearning for me, in my long process of healing, centered around the fantasy of perhaps being forgiven by these people who, at one time, had loved me. What I discovered was that prior to anyone forgiving me, I needed to forgive myself. 5 years after the restaurant incident, I received a letter from my former best man. He wrote, "I am sorry for walking out of that restaurant that night I saw you. I feel ashamed for being homophobic. Please forgive me." As I folded the letter over after sharing it with my therapist, he gently asked me to recall something I'd said about the dynamic of forgiveness. "Can you remember the wisdom you shared with me that day?" he asked. I began to cry and sheepishly said, "I shared with you that if I wanted them to forgive me, I had to first forgive myself." It was a topic I'd spent at least 6 sessions working on with my therapist, and I had only whispered, "If I forgive myself," a few weeks prior to receiving this letter from him. I had whispered to myself, "I forgive myself," and then I received the letter from my former best man. Imagine, if you can, and perhaps there's a circumstance where you were suddenly confronted by somebody you had not expressed your full truth to. Imagine walking into the restaurant and seeing that person and having your world come crashing down around you. For it might be in that moment that there might be reconciliation. There might be in that moment a greater war around what it is that you had created by not sharing the full aspect of your truth. Imagine thinking that that person might come to you and say, "It's all okay, I forgive you." Imagine thinking that person might come over and smack you in the head for actually not providing for that person. Now that they had the news that Dolan was a fag, that you hadn't told that entire truth to them. Well, they were your best friend, well, they were a confidant, well, they were somebody that really cared about you and you really cared about them. Imagine that for a moment. That was my circumstance in the restaurant that night. Oh, and I've shared, right, the running in me, the part of me that wanted to bolt. Had I been there on my own, Without this new love in my life to support me, I think I might have done that. That's my familiar, right? To run, and I'm really good at it. But what I'm most proud about was that really for the first time since coming out, the ground that I stood on, I owned. I didn't budge from it, regardless of what it was he was going to do or not do. That's a really solid self-care moment. I think in that also might be a boundary around becoming shame resilient, right? Because you can imagine what I felt, right, when he walked away. Granted, that was just a story that I made up, but ultimately it would be true. I thought he was being homophobic, and he'd apologize in a letter to me for being homophobic. So it would wind its way through the course. And of course, my narrative was absolutely true. If there's been a time where you're caught in that dynamic, right, I have no advice for you, but I can relate to, and I have great empathy if that's a circumstance that you've found yourself in. Here's the strongest anchor that was really evident and available to me immediately. And it was not to lean back on the old behavior. I didn't lean back on the old behavior. I didn't run, right? I didn't cower. I didn't not sit down at the table. I didn't not come into the restaurant. All really old behaviors. And they were taught to me, right? Don't engage. Don't have a conversation. Don't even think about how you're feeling. Allow it to be washed over you with shame. Get the hell out of there. That was the dynamic that existed for me in any confrontation that took place with the Dolans. I didn't do that. I didn't do that. So I continue to draw on that energy to remind myself that I can create boundaries. I can be strong. I can be brave. I can be vulnerable by being able to say to somebody, I'm scared and I'm going to choose to be brave. So it wasn't about, right, the confrontation and the notion that I'd lied to this person. It was way bigger than that, right? That's what happened to me. But how it was for me continues to inform my life around how it is that I choose to show up in my life. And I think that is probably one of the greatest gifts that I received from this coming out journey of mine. You know, back to what the priest had talked about. That was a moment of me being true to me. That was a moment of me realizing that, I could stoke the fire, inflame it, give energy to the shame I felt, but that was, at that time, 2 years ago. And I think I mentioned in the story, I wondered about all the healing I'd done over that period of time from when I saw him last. Here's what I realized the most, that sometimes people don't move from the place that you had that engagement with them, and you do. My work was to leave him where he was. My work was to walk with me on the path that I felt was the best place for me to be.